Today I'm reading from Leviticus 25, verse 39 to 43. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans and to the property of their ancestors. Because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. This is the word of the Lord. I thought we'd have another look at the topic of slavery today, and of course slavery is an ongoing reality in our world, in our country. Men and women from other countries are lured under false pretenses to Australia, where they become slaves, that they might be indentured slaves and they're forced to do housework for very little profit, forced even worse into prostitution as sex slaves. That happens in this country and it happens throughout the world. I want to talk more about the topic of slavery because the topic of slavery comes up in Leviticus, and the passage I just read to you talks about how slavery works. That is, if an Israelite becomes poor, they cannot be made a slave. If they sell themselves, they cannot be made a slave. And in that society, if you were a farmer and your land didn't bear a crop for a few years in a row, often the only option you had was to sell yourself, that is to mortgage yourself, in order to financially survive. But the Israelites were not allowed to make slaves of one another. And as we think about this topic of slavery, it can be quite confronting, because when we hear the word slave, most of us will think of the slavery that was happening in America, where not just America, but in England and Europe, where white people would go into Africa, kidnap Africans and take them against their will to England, America, and to the colonies, and force them to work as slaves. That's the kind of slavery that many of us have in our social imagination. But that kind of slavery is absolutely condemned in the Bible. In Exodus 21, verse 16, God's word says this: anyone who kidnaps another person and either sells them or still have them when they are caught must be put to death. That is how deeply the Old Testament condemns kidnapping of people and forcing them into slavery. So the kind of slavery we're talking about in the Old Testament is different to the kind of slavery that's often there in our social imagination, and the kind of slavery that happens in Australia, where you see people lured to Australia under false pretenses and forced into servitude or sex slavery or something terrible like that. The slavery going on in the Bible it's a different kind of slavery, and the Bible deeply condemns kidnapping. However, the whole topic of slavery is still confronting. The idea that a person can be owned by another person, in our freedom-loving culture, we find that offensive. I guess perhaps a helpful illustration of Old Testament, that kind of slavery happening in the Old Testament world, and also in the Greco-Roman world, which the New Testament was written into, it was a little bit like a mortgage, except instead of mortgaging your house, you would mortgage yourself and seek to pay off the debt. So being deeply in debt to a bank is in some ways similar to the slavery that would happen. Now, some of those slaves had a horrible life. Some of those slaves had quite a good life. But nonetheless, many of us as Christians wrestle with the idea of one human being owning another. What are we to make of the fact that God's word acknowledges this reality and even regulates it, rather than outwardly condemning it completely? And once again, our friend Kenneth Matthews is helpful. I just really appreciated what he wrote about this. He writes this: "There have been times when Christians justified the institution of slavery by selectively appealing to scriptures that regulate slavery." And he and I would agree we oughtn't do that. He says this: "The best way to understand the passages that accept slavery is the teaching that Jesus gave regarding divorce. He clarified that divorce was not the plan of God, but he permitted it, even regulated it, because of human hardness of heart. Because men and women are sinners and live in a fallen world, such things as divorce, and we can add for our purposes slavery, occur. It is sadly a part of the human experience, and the Bible sets out to first regulate treatment of slaves, and then to set the grounds for slavery's elimination. The Bible makes it clear that slaves were not mere chattel, but had God-given protections and certain rights. For example, see Exodus 21, verse 7 to 11. There you go. So there's an evangelical Christian's take on how we would take the biblical regulation of slavery. What do you think of that? What do you make of Kenneth Matthews' position? Well, another question I want to ask about slavery today is God racist? Because in verse 44 to 46 of Leviticus 25, God says this: "Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly." Is there a kind of racism going on here? Why will God allow his people to make slaves of foreigners but not of one another? And I was really struck to notice something about the passage today. First of all, the land does not belong to Israel. They can sell it to one another in the sense of they can lease it to one another, but they do not permanently own it. Leviticus 23, chapter 25, verse 23, "The land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. Throughout the land that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land." The land is not their land, it's God's land, and they are living in his land. There's the kindness of God there. Secondly, God's people belong to him. Verse 42, "The Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt." That's why they can't be slaves, because they are God's servants. Well, once again, at the end of all the instructions about slaves being set free for different reasons at the 50-year Jubilee, verse 54 says this: "Even if someone is not redeemed in any of these ways, they and their children are to be released in the year of Jubilee. For the Israelites belong to me as servants. They are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." Now, actually what's being protected here is not any kind of racism or preferential treatment. God is saying, because the Israelites are my property, they cannot be sold to another human being. They are mine. I've claimed them. And how did he claim them? He claimed them by saving them. And isn't it interesting that in the New Testament, when writing to New Testament believers who've been saved from sin, it says this: "You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of human beings." God bought his people Israel from Egypt to be his, and he has purchased us from sin to belong to him. He saved us so we belong to him. So how now will we live? God bless. I'll see you tomorrow.